substance equals spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 to 200, the politics and media podcast. You'll notice I'm no longer saying independent because we are the media now.
Because we're in the pocket of big X, whatever you want to say.
Yeah. Big independents, big indies. A lot of things that just don't exist. You might have listened to our current events episode yesterday. We are back off hiatus. And that means that everyone wants to do an episode with us now, all at once. We're doing 3 in a row. I'm recording Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And it's a lot of fun, and I'm really glad to have everyone here. I'm joined by my co-host, Simone. How are you?
Kia ora, I'm doing pretty well. We just saw each other at the 1 of 200 barbecue yesterday, but I'm back home in Kirikiriroa, so I've had to unfortunately take New Zealand's quality public transportation and experience that yet again.
Wonderful. I'm glad it got you back safe and sound. And we're joined by special guest, Jen Shields. How are you?
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here again.
For people who haven't heard our previous episode with you, what is your role?
Yeah, so I am the president of the Professional Association for Trans Health Aotearoa, and I'm healthcare lead at Qtopia, which is a little rainbow social support service based down here in Ōtautahi, Christchurch. So my day job at the moment is running training for primary care all around the country around gender diversity and gender affirming care. And more broadly than that, trans health advocacy and education work.
Fantastic. And the reason we're doing a podcast today is because I think it was on like late in the week just gone, as they want to do when something might be controversial. The Ministry of Health dropped a review of the current state of healthcare, especially around puberty blockers, is my understanding. And there were immediately a lot of reactionary groups who were ready to jump on that and start drumming it up as a wedge issue. I'm both constantly disappointed with legacy media that it is unable to fairly talk about this issue, or even, let alone with any sense of care for the people impacted with it. But also, they often don't run with any of the really, really nasty stuff, which is, I guess, a saving grace, but like also like that the bar is in the ocean somewhere in the Mariana Trench. Jen, are you able to give us a quick rundown of what this new advice that came out late in the week indicates, and also kind of opens up conversations around?
Yeah, absolutely. So this all started a couple of years ago now when the Ministry of Health started receiving, frankly, a ridiculous number of emails and messages about some particular wording on their website around the use of puberty blockers. And yeah, the anti-trans lobby crowd noticed at one point that wording had changed and it had removed the phrase safe and effective from the information on the ministry's website about puberty blockers and jumped on it as evidence that the ministry had changed its mind and that puberty blockers were dangerous and, the root of all evil. And what had actually happened was that they were spending a really significant amount of resources replying to people's emails explaining why the website said what they did. So they changed it. It was an administrative decision at the time, but that kind of political pressure from that really disinformation-fueled crowd in particular led the government at the time to request an evidence brief into the use of puberty blockers for gender-affirming healthcare specifically. And I think that was 2022, and here we are now. The brief has finally been released. We've been expecting it for roughly a year. And has been delayed pretty significantly, sometimes because of new evidence that has arisen, but for the most part because this has become such a highly political issue that at times has led to risks to people's personal safety. So finally this week, Thursday morning, that evidence brief and accompanying position statement from the ministry was released. the evidence brief itself says kind of what we knew it was going to say, and we touched on this in the last episode I was in around the CAS review, found that there's, limited quality evidence for both the risks and the benefits of puberty blockers and the use of gender-affirming care for trans young people. And when we talk about limited quality evidence, it's really a technical academic term, right? Like we're talking about certain kinds of studies and the way that they are carried out and the way that they mitigate risk of bias and things. And generally, the gold standard for medical evidence are randomized control trials, where you give one group an intervention and one group a placebo, and no one knows who's got what. But as I think pretty much anyone can figure out within 30 seconds of thinking through that, if you give a group of kids puberty blockers and another group of kids placebo, they're going to find out pretty quickly who's got the placebo. So it's not really a blind trial. There are ethical concerns around, withholding necessary medical interventions for the purpose of a research trial. People drop out of the studies, and it's not the only area of health where that lack of quality evidence, is an issue. And when we're talking about evidence-based medicine, we're talking about not just academic evidence, but also clinical experience and patient values. So that has always existed in relationship with the other three. And then the ministry's position statement really describes the kind of care that is already being delivered here in Aotearoa. So they recommend that, practitioners who are prescribing puberty blockers have some expertise in the area, that they work in interdisciplinary teams, that the people they work with have access to mental health and social support when they need it. And that's, as far as I'm aware, and anyone I speak to is aware, that's exactly what's happening all around the country. So yeah, like you touched on, we saw some pretty quick reactions from some of the political parties claiming a victory and that there were new rules coming into effect today that were going to clamp down on prescribing, but that's absolutely not what's happened. What has come along with these documents, though, is a concerning new development where the government has asked the Ministry of Health to engage in public consultation about the possibility of further restrictions on puberty blockers. And that's not a clinical decision. That's not coming from the Ministry of Health or their clinical governance groups or their executive leadership team. It's a request that's been made by the coalition government, which I think is what most of us are really concerned about, is the politicization of our healthcare.
Yeah, it seems very clear that although, you've laid out, okay, this is exactly what it means to not have clear evidence or whatever you want to call it. The government might have been relying on people misreading that, and especially in concert with its coalition partners, ACT and New Zealand First, to immediately request further consultation seems really like jumping the shark. Like, is this just? I mean, that is what this is, right? Like, it's not me just like conspiracizing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a political intervention to me, right? Like the position statement itself is very clear that the government has indicated that they are interested in restrictions. The language that the ministry has used is very careful and explicit there. If you take a look at the public consultation form, the way that it asks the questions that it does, preempting further restrictions. So there's one in particular that asks, the public to make their feelings known about a medical issue, asks what people think should happen next, whether puberty blockers should be available only to those who already have a prescription or only to those in a clinical trial or other. So the current approach, which is in line with the ministry's position statement, is lumped into other. So the way they have kind of framed those questions by the default is restrictions.
It's evil.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty unusual. I would struggle to think of another medical matter that would, have taken this approach. Yeah, it's pretty shocking.
I wonder then if you could talk, because for a lot of people, this is a kind of academic sort of discussion, right? A puberty blocker is a medicine that they might not understand. So if you could talk about the human cost of what it would mean for us to follow the path that the United Kingdom is doing and essentially trying to remove transness from public life through this medicalization and this restriction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people new to these conversations and, the idea of puberty blockers, even as an intervention, can be quite new or unusual or confronting for some people. But I would really encourage people who, are uncertain about this to put themselves in the body of someone who, is on the verge of experiencing a whole host of physical changes to their body that they're, not really sure about. They might have questions about their identity, they might not be certain, but even being in that place where you're like, I don't know if what's about to happen is going to be right for me, knowing that there's an intervention out there that could give you the time to really come to a decision about, what you're comfortable with and what's best for you, and then having that intervention taken away from you and having those irreversible changes really forced on you, despite, what we know from the evidence, what we know from clinical practice, a decision made by politicians forcing those physical changes on you. It's really distressing and, incredibly traumatic for a lot of people, right? And I think within the first 24 hours of that evidence brief coming out, I had, 3 or 4 families message me really worried for the well-being of their children, for their ability to access healthcare. And like we've seen in the UK, people have been encouraged to leave the country if they can, parents of trans children if they have the means, which is incredibly traumatic and stressful, right? And I guess it's part of that broader, efforts we see internationally, not just in England, but particularly in America as well. And like you touched on, Simone, it starts with healthcare for young people as a bit of a wedge issue. But, we've seen legislation introduced in the States to restrict gender affirming care for all ages. We're seeing these bathroom bans being introduced for all ages. We've had similar moves from New Zealand First here. It, really is the kind of easiest place for them to start.
Is there a risk of, especially in respect of public consultation, a kind of astroturfing, not necessarily even from overseas, but locally as well, through people who might be a minority, but they're a very vocal minority, sort of inserting themselves into this public consultation? TERFs. I'm talking about TERFs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've already seen people mobilizing their networks to generate as many submissions as they possibly can. And we know that, a number of these groups have a huge proportion of their following is from overseas. I think in real terms, a number of people here in Aotearoa who, really follow those beliefs is, like you say, a vocal minority. But they have a lot of time in their hands, and they are already really pushing people to make those submissions. And I think the timing of this process, like you said, it's, when they want to something for not to cause a stir, but the submission period is open now until the 20th of January. So over summer when people are on holiday, they're not engaged. It lines up really neatly with the consultation on the Treaty Principles Bill. Like, I think there's been a very intentional act around this timing.
With the way it's been used as a really nasty little wedge issue, and particularly in the US and UK, it felt like we'd weathered the storm at least slightly here for a while, and that some of the really kind of more overt policy and legislation hadn't been introduced here. Some of that rhetoric was being actively dismissed by the National Party, the centre-right governing party at the moment. Have you got any insight into what exactly changed here for them to weaponize this academic language, which says the opposite of what they're now trying to claim, essentially, and give more leeway to their coalition partners who have, by and large, been the groups that are openly representing what do you want to call it, far-right fascist TERFs, any conglomeration or individual groups thereof.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the coalition partners. Like, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, right? So throughout this process, as it's been delayed, PATHA has never been involved, properly. We requested when the evidence brief was initially announced because, it's within our membership is the vast majority of, clinical experience in trans healthcare here in Aotearoa. So it seemed to us to make sense that, the ministry was undertaking work on a particular area of gender affirming healthcare, they would want to consult with the experts. But apparently not. But so we didn't really ever have a good idea of when it might come out or the timelines, but every now and again we would get an indication, usually when the Ministry of Health had informed the Science Media Centre that it was going to come out on a certain date, and invariably a PATHA member would be asked to comment because that's where the expertise lied. And there was one point a few months ago now, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, where it kind of got the closest it had ever got. We'd been suggested that it might come a couple of times and then nothing would happen. And then this particular occasion, Science Media Centre had been given a really particular date and time that it was going to be released. And then it came and went again. And then no one heard anything for a matter of months. And the feeling that I got and the kind of guesses that most people were having was that it had got really close to publishing, and then the brief had been sent to the coalition partners, and then that had caused a significant delay. So I suspect that's probably what has happened, is that, it has at some point come to a final stage, and then the government has done their due diligence and let the coalition partners know, and then it got so politicized beyond the clinical and academic state that it was in, that I think has probably led us to where we are now. So I think that has probably what shifted in terms of, we had been able to kind of, stem the tide of some of those regressive policies from overseas. And I think we will obviously continue to fight against those further restrictions, because I don't think the ministry necessarily agrees that they're necessary either. But I suspect it's the coalition party's involvement that has led us to this particular point, and we can see that in how quickly both ACT and New Zealand First had their statements ready to go.
Which were just horrific, by the way.
Yeah, horrible, horrible. I mean,
Like,
a week after the abuse
yeah.
state care apology, you have the Minister for Children comparing gender affirming care to torture at Lake Alice. Like, it's
Like I think it almost, I can't think of even many utterances from overseas that like meet that level.
Yeah, no, me neither. Yeah,
And
overseas
and
they
it just,
couched it in that language of safety for children
yeah.
and protection and care, and then to have a minister of this government make such a nasty comparison is
And you always get into these questions of, oh, because media aren't, I think a lot of media didn't report on it. And there's this question of, oh, okay, maybe it's better not to platform it in case it spreads the message. But at that point, you're so far into the ludicrous that people need to know that, like, the Minister for Children is a monster. And I'd like, any thoughts on why it's not being covered fairly either?
it's a really good question. I think probably we're at a point now where most media are aware of how politicized the issue has become. So I suspect it's well-meaning, not wanting to engage with the nastiest stuff. But I think you're right. I think the Minister for Children sharing statements like that feels newsworthy in and of itself, regardless of what the issue might have been about. Like, it's a pretty glaring and shocking move. But I guess in line with how they have responded to the abuse and state care stuff,
Yeah,
regardless.
yeah. It's just one of those, I guess this is true in every country so far, and with a range of different issues like this. It's really stunning to me. Oh no, it's not really. I want to be clear. It's not. I'm not surprised. But I'm still shocked on some level that the majority of the electorate generally doesn't agree with like the bad takes on this. We got the entirety of clinical expertise and academia saying, okay, no, this is how it works in practice. Like, people are going to die. Like, if you don't have good healthcare in this regard, and then some politicians like, okay, we should be really careful with it. Blah blah blah. Like, a lot of people are seeming to understand that, and then they just turn around and go, "Oh, nah, actually, we're going to do everything in bad faith from now on, and we don't give a fuck." And like, how do you compete against that? Are there any kind of strategies like, like I'm going to say coming out of the US UK, but they've clearly not been successful there in stopping this stuff. It seems to be this cohort of really powerful people, political decision makers, and also within the media, like opinion makers, who are just completely convinced of the most reactionary, hateful disinformation about trans healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting thinking about England and the UK because I was talking to some friends who were based there recently, and what they were sharing with me, they were saying like it's so different on the ground to what you see online and in the media. Like, my friend Ruth in particular was saying like it's the gayest she's ever seen England is out on the street at the moment. It's like the absolute relentless atmosphere of transphobia that exists in their media systems in particular, either doesn't seem to be having an effect on people in day to day in terms of suppressing their visibility, or, I think probably is causing more people to be visibly queer and trans in public, out of spite, which seems to be a common trend for our community, right?
Yeah, funny.
Yeah, it happens. So I'm really interested to like hear and learn more about what things are actually like on the ground in places where these really regressive, restrictive policies have come into play, really tangibly, because I suspect there's some real community building and resistance that we aren't seeing from the
Yeah.
outside that, I think is quite robust for those who are there on the ground. And that's okay. Like it's not for us, right? But it's still helpful to learn about it and hear about it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
think
well, in respect of medication, like DIY has long existed. I think that will probably increase in the United Kingdom, given what's going on there. That if you can't get something through an official channel and it is life-saving medication, that doing it through alternative channels will need to be done. And yet, there is always, however small a modicum of risk with that sort of thing, right? It's sort of preferred for a lot of people to go through those professional channels for that reason, which is not to discourage anybody from gender affirming healthcare if they live in a state which is repressive. But I think that it's not going to not exist, right? Like the intention is to kind of get rid of transness or queerness from public life, to make it sort of not seen, not heard. Don't ask, don't tell again. But it, people won't cease to exist. Although when I do say that, I mean, when we talk about the risks associated with restrictions on puberty blockers, I was just reading some of the PATHA Aotearoa guidelines, and there was some very, very useful, I think, work in respect of trans people's mental health, and especially for young people. So the University of Waikato had done a study called Counting Ourselves, and it found that 71% of transgender people were experiencing currently high levels of psychological distress. More than half of those surveyed had seriously thought about suicide in the past 12 months, which reminds me, Kyle, you're going to have to put some kind of content warning up front
Already
for this
thinking about it.
episode. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty heavy episode. And 37% had made some form of attempt, right? And looking at those numbers, when somebody is forced to go through the kind of body horror and total loss of autonomy of going through the wrong puberty, that can cause a lot of suicidality, right? Like this, in the United Kingdom experience at least, has directly caused deaths of young people from the denial of their life-saving medication. And if we see further restrictions here, it is inevitable that there will be more dead young people at the hands of these politicians. And I think that when we talk about, the supposed risks or the scares that are kind of invented and confabulated, like, what the Minister for Children was saying about, comparing it to Lake Alice, I think for reactionaries, almost every accusation is a kind of confession, right? And in this case, there is real evidence that there is material harm and there is a human toll and a human cost to the denial of medication for people who are transgender, queer, in some way don't conform to what's happening to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, that's really clear in the evidence brief that they are all touting as, proof that we're doing the wrong thing, right? They have not found evidence of harm. What they have found in the evidence is a slowing in the rate of bone density growth, but they have not indicated or drawn any more conclusions about, whether that leads to further harm, whether that leads to fractures. They've been really explicit in not saying that. So what we do have is, not very strong evidence about harms, lots of conversation about potential harms versus what we can clearly see in the research base around the mental health impacts of dysphoria and, having to undergo the puberty that might not be right for you. And I think there's a like a real intentional misunderstanding on behalf of a lot of the people who are really anti-puberty blockers about the purpose of puberty blockers in the first place, right? Because often that there isn't strong evidence for the benefits on mental health or gender dysphoria or body satisfaction only makes sense if you think that puberty blockers are going to fix those things, which again, if you put yourself in the body of someone who maybe has already experienced some changes to their body that they're not happy with or unsure about, puberty blockers will prevent any further changes, but you are still sitting in that body that, maybe isn't right for you. So it's natural that this intervention isn't going to magically fix people's dysphoria, isn't going to magically fix their body satisfaction. We do see some benefit in terms of, quality of life and mental health stuff, because the relief of knowing that you're in this pause can be really beneficial. But it's really intellectually dishonest to attempt to restrict this medication because of something that they're not intended to do in the first place.
Well, I think it's really important to talk about future strategy in the context of that, because oftentimes we take a kind of defensive posture, and I just use sort of a very, very broad we right there. And I think that it does differ between PATHA organizations, but there is somewhat of an assumption that puberty blockers are, if not a gold standard, then a kind of presumption for young people who are questioning in some way, but they are a holding pattern. The ideal really would be that if you are a young person and you're able to have the autonomy to make medical decisions for yourself, like, for example, a 15-year-old who gets an abortion, if you believe that is a necessary human right, then somebody who has an understanding of themselves and their identity should be able to take cross-sex hormones. It should be able to actually transition. And the reason why I think there is a lot of that kind of, not necessarily mixed evidence, but there isn't strong evidence either of harm or that this is some kind of huge relief, is exactly because it is a holding pattern. So strategically, whether or not we think about saying, okay, perhaps it's best not to have a compromised position with these people, but to say that actually the gold standard is to be in a world where people can understand that and not have that kind of, to kind of draw on social theory very briefly, this intense cis heteronormativity, which causes people to not question or consider their personal feelings or the feelings of discomfort or dysphoria, and not even to recognize or identify those until well into adulthood, that we might be able to say that actually our maximalist demand is transition once people have that sort of understanding of themselves where they have the autonomy to be able to do that. And puberty blockers, if they are not sure, but that in itself is not the end point, is not the kind of gold standard. And for better or for worse, it seems to me from looking through some of the various PATH organizations that is the way that it is presented. I mean, you're of course the president of PATH Aotearoa, so you might have a different view on that, but
And that's something that, even Hilary Cass herself says in the Cass review, right? She makes it clear that for some young people, actually moving on to, gender affirming hormone therapy earlier is the best move for them. And that certainly is not something you have seen the anti-trans lobby engage with at all, because they are, again, not actually in favor of the health and well-being of trans young people. They are just anti-gender in general. And you can see that in, you brought up DIY earlier, and I think that's a really interesting example, because in lots of parts of the UK and Ireland in particular, GPs are mandated against doing bloods for people who are on DIY hormone therapy. Like, if you are arguing from a place where what you hold as your value is the health and safety of everyone, then you should be advocating for harm reduction. You should be advocating for people who are accessing hormone therapy online to be able to access, blood tests to monitor their levels and monitor their health and well-being. But instead, these people are drawing a hard line in the sand, and the line is not pro-health, pro-safety, it is anti-gender.
I was just going to let the two of you keep talking about this because it's fascinating
Oh.
and really useful and really useful.
I don't want to probe too much because I think that, I have great respect for the work that a lot of these sorts of organizations do, but there are real sort of broader questions for us about when we talk about tackling it. I think something that one of the other guests who's been on a few times, Gigi, has talked about is that the Heritage Foundation identified once Obergefell and Hodges passed the quote unquote gay marriage case through the Supreme Court of the United States, that trans people were a vulnerable enough minority group without much public understanding of them, because most people don't care, because why would you care, right? This is the thing about the bathroom stuff, is that like most people don't think that like genital inspection of children is really fucking strange, actually. So most people don't really have, or didn't really have much of an understanding publicly of what it was to be transgender or anything even surrounding that. And so they identified that was the weak point, the chink in the armor that they would start to attack. And we've seen that all sorts of fascist movements, in whatever form they've taken throughout either the Anglosphere or in some cases in Europe as well, have approached is trying to use this as a kind of wedge that they're driving into, to leverage that, to kind of open the floodgates for other kinds of attacks, right? And it is an intersection between a lot of things. And I think for a lot of people for whom this isn't something that personally matters to them, this is why it's important to understand it, right? Like, this is why we have to understand that it's all kind of one battle. It's all kind of one fight, really. Because yes, the autonomy of children is also something which is really important. Like, that's a fight which is nascent and which doesn't have much public discussion. And for a lot of transgender people, they tend to have lower earnings rates, that tend to have, suffer under regimes with fewer labor protections. Like, New Zealand is an example where we do have some labor protections, but still people will face that in their lives. I've experienced that personally, and a lot of people that I know are, very low earning who are in the community, So a labor struggle is also united and linked with that. But the reason why I wanted to sort of bring up that kind of couching for, yes, it is really respectable and very useful, the kind of professional organizations which try to tackle it from that medical perspective, is that something like gender intersects with medicality, but it isn't itself, right? There are so many different models and ways of viewing it. And although there will be many GPs who are very good and some who are interested in further education, a lot of them will be closed off to it, and a lot of them won't be interested. And furthermore, that there isn't that much funding for this sort of research. So a lot of the research on transfeminine hormones comes from that for cisgender women. And a lot of the reasons why, like, for example, PATHA Aotearoa's current guidelines says, that changes in breast growth, for example, top out at about 3 years. It's just because most of the studies stop studying people after that time. It's not necessarily because people don't do that. But if you wanted to look at it further and grade it further, you could say, well, actually, if you want to look at the work of like Geraldine Pryor et al. In the American journals, that there has been an emphasis on progesterone as a part of a normal hormone profile, something which is missing from the guidelines in New Zealand. So there is always going to be, I think, if you take a purely kind of professional approach, leaving the strategy in the hands of people who are in many ways, for worse, I was going to say better for worse, but much for the worse, denigrated by this kind of unraveling of liberal democracy, right? Because experts are something we've seen that has been attacked over and over again. It's sometimes called Trumpian, but this happens throughout the 20th century with fascism, is that people who have some kind of expertise are kind of attacked by kind of faux populists. And therefore, for some people, saying evidence-based doesn't necessarily evoke to them a kind of ontological truth, or an epistemological truth, I should say. And there's a real open question for us as to what the best approach and strategy is, and whether or not we're putting all of our eggs in one basket by medicalizing transness.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right, right? And I think there are a lot of people out there doing a lot of work in terms of trans liberation more broadly. And I think, PATHA and the other professional associations have like a really specific role to play relating to healthcare and medicine and, that kind of often typically Western expertise we often privilege. And I think we've seen, really productive shifts in the last, couple of decades in particular when it comes to demedicalizing trans identities and depathologizing trans identities in particular. And yeah, I'm really keen to see that, work continue, because there are trans people who need medical systems and gender affirming healthcare. It's not all of us, but it is a really important part of the support that our community more broadly needs. But that's not the be all and end all of trans identity or trans liberation or our human rights more generally, because like you touched on, it intersects also with labor rights and the right to self-determination more broadly, and the right to live safely and in public, which seems to be the most at threat at the moment through all these moves we see internationally. And I think I really keep coming back to Judith Butler's latest work on gender as this idea of a phantasm, or a way of like collecting up people's fears and worries about the world that is then used, not with goodwill for the people who have fears about the world, but as a way of kind of distracting from those fears, which often are grounded in existential threats of climate change and economic collapse. And instead of, addressing those things, which our governments should be doing, they are spending time engaging in public consultation about puberty blockers.
And I think, yeah, Butler draws very well, not more recently, but in their work in the 90s, from that kind of Foucauldian tradition, that biopolitics are politics acting upon the body, which I think is a really useful thing of thinking about, because exactly like you're saying, in respect of that notion of the phantasm, that for a lot of people who don't need to question their identity in any way, or for them that kind of stability of gender as something immutable is really important to being able to turn the blinders on, to not having to consider or to look up or to understand the fractures and the disjunctures that are happening in our world and that are going to increase. And sometimes literally with the weather around us, like with climate change. So I totally agree that that's quite a salient thing to think about, with this, that getting people to understand it is in many ways almost breaking down the assuredness of cisgenderness, right? And part of that is identifying that there are so many cis people who've never heard the word cisgender in their lives. This is just what like the blind reality is, right?
Thanks, Elon.
The stability, the kind of false stability of it. Yeah, banning that word from Twitter, but that kind of censorship, it really does have that effect, right? Yeah. That invisibilization process that happens.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that basically just ends up going under the radar, right? Because we end up fighting on the terrain that the reactionaries and the fascists want, because they can just throw shit around. They can just say the most outrageous shit. And then you're immediately having to scramble, because this is an immediate physical risk to members of a community, people you love, like however you want to say. And there's a requirement to act on that, right? Like a moral imperative to immediately respond, and much less time to build a structure around it in the manner that you've outlined, Simone, that allows us to actually get consolidated wins and move policy. And it's another effect of and we've been talking about way too much recently, but ratchet politics, like where it's moved like two or three to the left and locks back slightly
Oh,
to the
like a
right.
rat shit.
Yeah, like a ratchet, not like a shit that a rat did.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I
Yeah,
got you.
yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah,
That
yeah,
for a second I was yeah.
yeah, yeah. And we're just moving slightly and slightly. And this is exactly what has happened in this particular case where it
Mhm.
felt like, given how quickly the UK and the US were moving, Aotearoa had somewhat managed to weather the storm, but here we are. No, they just decided they're gonna really fuck with stuff now. And I guess for the last part of the conversation, I wanted to ask you, Jen, like what what do we do at this point? What can people do who want to um, support trans healthcare, who want to support queer communities, and including people who are cis or who are not who don't know any trans people, right? Like who haven't interacted with the term cisgender because all they get all the news from Twitter, like me. How do they engage with this? And what are groups out there doing to try and fight back that isn't just doing another submission, hoping it sticks, but then in 2 years' time, we're back three more steps.
Yeah, this is like, I think maybe the biggest conversation we are having at the moment as a community, and it's come up in quite a few spaces that I sit in now. And I have been wanting for the last couple of years in particular, as I've seen these shifts, happen, and particularly as I've seen the like increased risk to people's physical safety starting to really tangibly present itself. I've been really keen for us, like collectively, to engage in some more proactive work around, cultural shift, because we have had to be so reactive when it comes to these things that are coming. And at the moment we have a particular government in power, but we also, are all doing as much as we can on the smell of an oily rag. And meanwhile, you have, parties like ACT with their, Atlas Network associates and funding, and there's a lot of money being funneled in to the anti-trans lobby, and it means that we are constantly reacting and responding and fighting to it more than we are being proactive in terms of our community building and the cultural shift work that we are trying to create. So I think, the conclusion that a number of us seem to keep coming to at this point in time is that actually we probably need to like start letting some of the reactive stuff go. Like I think there are some really critical pieces of work that, do still need us to put in a submission, and I would absolutely encourage people to write one for this and to engage with the Treaty Principles Bill Select Committee process as well. But I think like we need to look to each other. We need to like really build communities locally, physically close to us. And I think like where we see those shifts happen in this piece of work in particular is when like everyone in the country has a trans person they know in their network that humanizes it, right? Like it shouldn't be the case, but we know that it works when it does. So I think some of us need to put our hands up to be like, I'll be the token trans person. But I think people should also reach out, like connect with their local networks, their local community organizations, go to Pride events, even if you're not currently part of the rainbow community. I think it can be really beneficial to have some tangible connection to those spaces in your day to day, because that helps you contribute to that work. And this is all like a grassroots shift, right? Like so often we think about these systems and structures as really big, slow moving, massive beasts, but they are all made up of people and dark money, I guess. But, we maybe can't address the money side of things, but we can address the people, right? So, you change the viewpoints of the few people around you that might have some, odd views about gender, and hopefully those people might talk to a few other people, and then that's how a lot of that cultural shift moves. So I think, yeah, across a number of the issues that us collectively as a, national community, not just rainbow stuff, are dealing with at the moment, that's probably the answer to a lot of them is that community building and working together. But particularly for this, because there is a really tangible impact of someone knowing a trans person, I think that is a really significant impact too.
Got it. Simone, any thoughts from you?
So many Kyle. Um, yeah, I mean, I was thinking about the kind of destabilization of identity and othering and all of that, but I think that's really abstract for people. There's so many kind of layers to get through with that, right? To understand, and we could talk about this forever, and we should actually. But uh, my answer is always the same answer, which is that to understand how to resist, understand what the superstructure is and how that interacts with the base, like understand what the political economy of the society that you exist within is. And for us, that is our peculiar kind of settler colonial capitalism as it sort of emerged as a kind of mode of production within these islands. And the particular formation of the neoliberal period for us. So, in many ways, I was talking about the kind of immiseration of queer people and trans people before, but for other people, understand that your way of shifting the needle is through labor struggle primarily. There are other ones. I think tenants unions are really important because the precarity of shelter is also something that is quite salient for us. Homelessness among youth who get thrown out when their families find out that they're queer is a real problem, and our scarcity in that regard is also something that's really important. But yes, that kind of struggle that join a union, organize, make, just shut down anybody who tries to take that kind of weird red brown reactionary view that we don't need to have queer pronouns at the start of our meeting, blah blah blah, sort of thing. You've got to somehow get on the right like Malcap, and then like dress a certain way and sound like a tradie if you want to have success in labor. It's not true at all. Organized labor is made up of every kind of person, and that's exactly what it is. That is one of the locuses for democratization and for meeting new people and for kind of becoming that. I mean, like Jen was saying, a token trans person, if you are a trans person or if you are a queer person, but in many ways just kind of getting off Discord and out into the community. Not that there's anything wrong with connecting up with people who are similar to you around the world. I would be a hypocrite if I said that, but yeah, exactly that it is the same struggles as for everything else. This is one of the things that Toi Tu Te Tiriti, that's a really critical part of that. I think that's also intersecting with queer struggle because our ways of understanding gender are very much in reaction to Victorian English conceptions. And so for Indigenous people, it's not related at all, like this kind of very peculiar sort of binary that's been imposed on Aotearoa. So, all of these things connect up with each other, and it is really important to get involved with all of them, because you have to gum up the wheels. At some point, something has to give. There has to be a point where it is important enough to put your body on the gears to stop the machine. And I think that is what I really want to leave with. And also, and this is not endorsed by our guest or PATHA, but be gay and do crimes.
Fantastic. Jen, just finally, where can people go to find information?
Yeah, so our website is patha.nz, and you can find our statement about the position statement and comments that some of our leadership have given to media, which is really useful. Yeah, I think one of 200's contributors wrote a really excellent submission guide that maybe could be in the show notes, but I think that's a really good place to start. Keep engaged with local communities. Rainbow Support Collective is a really great network. They are rainbowsupportcollective.nz, but are made up of a good number of our organizations around the country who are doing work not just in this particular issue, but around rainbow liberation more generally. And make a submission. I feel so strange saying that because PATHA has had a very clear public view that actually public consultation on an issue like this is inappropriate, but that decision has been made. So It's really important for everyone to have their say, because we know the worst people you've ever met are going to have their say. So we've got to drown that out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so
And
much.
yeah, thank you, Simone, for joining us as a co-host tonight. And thanks
Not at
for
all.
listening, everybody.
I love being the token trans person.
We will be doing another episode tomorrow, but I don't know when these will release. This might release in a couple of days. So Monday or Tuesday is when our first listeners may be listening to this. Please share, like, and subscribe. Let more people know that this stuff is out there. Or even if you're just passing on like the websites, so that people can read the stuff. You know, not everyone listens to podcasts. I am notorious for being a podcast producer, but listening to zero podcasts, it's horrific. I know. There's so much information out there for you to upskill yourself with. There's so many different ways to engage with this stuff. Yeah, please just get involved, get engaged, and get to work. We'll catch you next time.
If artificers are then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now is paved with good intentions. And I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they criticize a cost me ought to stay. Cause I live amongst the people every day. This vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're